Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to this Faith and Entrepreneurship Roundtable. We are grateful to all of you for joining us today. And on behalf of One Hope and the Coalition of Transformational Churches, we just wanted to thank you. For the last 10 years, One Hope has served the Coalition of Transformational Churches as part of our global work. CTC is a network of apostolic leaders representing thousands of Christian communities and millions of Christians. These leaders are passionate about the global church's vitality and effectiveness. Several years ago, as leaders, we began to discuss the sweeping implications of both globalization and urbanization on our work. And what emerged was a growing conviction that Christian communities needed to transform the relationship between church and society, between ministry and marketplace. The global church needs to accelerate its engagement and partnership with faith-based market leaders. It needs new models of collaboration to support entrepreneurship, to increase its impact and legitimacy in communities, to strengthen the institutions of Christian communities, and perhaps most importantly, to transform its relationship with young people as they build their future in a technology-rich, dynamic world. CTC has committed itself to supporting this evolution of the global church's work among young people. And these challenges and opportunities only become more critical as we begin to rebuild following the current COVID-19 crisis. So CTC and One Hope believe Christian communities must become the indispensable partner of every young person to discover their gifts and their callings as image bearers of God and have the opportunity to serve their world in new and diverse ways, motivated by love for Christ. We are committed to developing new models and collaboration to see this goal achieved. And for us, this gathering represents a foundational step in that process. All of you are critical thought leaders and practitioners in the area of faith-based market leadership and entrepreneurship. So our commitment is to learn from you and to translate your insights into emerging practice and scalable models among the tens of thousands of Christian communities we serve around the world every year. We want to begin our time together with prayer. If you join me in prayer. Lord, we ask that you would be with us today, that our minds and hearts would be quickened and opened, that we'd be united in love. Lord, we ask that you would lead us by your Spirit and that the conversations today would be real and transparent and vulnerable and filled with faith and love and humility, that we could learn from each other, that we could serve this world in your church more effectively. Lord, we ask for your help. We ask for you to be with us today. And may these conversations, the words of our mouth, the thoughts of our heart, may all of it be pleasing in your sight, Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. So we've assembled a panel to start our discussions today, representing some of the key aspects of faith-based entrepreneurship. And we've already sent you the recordings of their interviews, but we wanted to briefly hear from each of them. So I'd like to welcome Jen Brown to introduce our panel.
Thanks, Chad. Hello, everyone. I am very excited for this panel session as we continue the important conversation that we started about faith and entrepreneurship on the video interviews. Like Chad said, each of you should have received access to them. In case you weren't able to watch them ahead of this, we have asked the panelists, which is exciting, to be with us again today to continue the rich conversation. If you did miss the interviews by chance, I'd really like to encourage everyone to watch them after the roundtable. I think everyone will be encouraged by the breadth of topics covered and just the rich conversation that we've already had so far. So let me quickly introduce our panelists. Once again, we have with us Pastor Eve Mungai, and Pastor Eve is the Executive Director of ICC Nairobi. She is not only an influential leader of a large majority world church, but her experience also includes leading NGOs focused on fostering social entrepreneurship and economic development. Next, we have Philip Zeldenhuis. Philip is the co-founder and CEO at Triga Ventures. Triga Ventures is a South African faith-driven nonprofit accelerator. And in addition to that, Philip leads a collaborative working group of the top faith-inspired accelerators across the world. And that group includes Triga, Praxis, Ocean, Faith-Driven Entrepreneur, Lion's Den, and many, many more. Also with us, we have Scott Weiss. Scott is the chairman of Ocean Accelerator, and he is a marketplace leader who has served for over 22 years in various C-suite positions at multiple Fortune 500 companies, and is a member of Crossroads Church in Cincinnati. Last but certainly not least, we have Kyle Bodie. Kyle is Vice President of Strategy at the Kern Family Foundation. Kern is an important funding partner of churches and pastors, and they've also heavily invested in the area of faith and work. Kyle also sits on the board to Made to Flourish. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining today. And as we get started with our questions, I'd like to welcome everyone on the call to add any questions or any feedback that you may have for the panelists directly into the chat. I will be moderating the chat and I can ask those questions for you to the panelists. So let's get started. Okay, my first question is for Pastor Eve. Could you please spend just a couple of minutes answering this question? Besides being a pastor, you've been a leader of economic development programs. What is your assessment of traditional practices and foreign-sponsored and government-sponsored economic development programs? And what can we learn as a community from their successes and their failures?
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for everybody. Hello, good evening here in Kenya. And it's a pleasure and honor to join this roundtable. I hope you can hear me well. I think for me, when I think about foreign-sponsored, government-sponsored programs, they have a good impact when they are used well, when the funding is used well. I find that funding tends to be, foreign government-sponsored programs and have an advantage in crisis situations, say like now with the COVID-19, in a humanitarian crisis where you need a large injection of funds, when you're looking at major infrastructural kind of programs. And but I find that with the long term, especially in the development context, sometimes it's not very useful, because then sometimes it brings in imbalances in terms of donor and beneficiary relationships, power dynamics. It skews the local economy if it's not thought through well. And then also sometimes funding comes with conditionalities that don't always align to the values of the people who are receiving. And therefore you find recipients of funding now beginning to align their values to the donor and to the funder, rather than holding true to what they believe in, what their context requires and needs. And then sometimes also there's incidences of corruption. When you have funding that is coming in, that is coming in at a large amount, it's coming from a foreign source. Sometimes bribery takes place so that people are, either from the funder perspective and kickbacks and things like that. And it can really skew the local economy. But then on the good side of it, like I say, in short-term, large injection of funds, it makes sense. It can create a great economic stimulus to a local community and just uplift the standards and quality of living of the people. And then also many a time when you're looking at government-sponsored funding, it tends to come with a lot of bureaucracies and requires the recipients or beneficiaries of that funding to really think through what are they going to be, what kind of a difference do they intend to make, put in monitoring and evaluation mechanisms and planning mechanisms. So sometimes then they're able to really think critically and be able to demonstrate what is the outcome of that funding, what are they receiving it for. So it does encourage critical thinking also in the communities or the organizations or the people who are going to receive that funding. So there's both good sides and bad sides to it. But then I tend to find that taking a more social entrepreneurship model where you empower people with funding and skills that can allow themselves to continue, in the long haul, sustainably develop or take care of their own livelihoods, take care of their own entrepreneurship journeys, rather than feeding people then you teach them how to feed themselves. So taking a more empowerment-oriented model becomes very critical than just giving funding without necessarily helping people to think through what is the long-term sustainability of it.
Thank you, Pastor E. I really appreciate that. Our next question is going to be for Philip. Philip, would you give us an overview of what is happening in this sector of faith-inspired entrepreneurship programs around the world? What is working? What's possibly not working?
Thank you so much, Jen. Great to be here. And such a timely conversation. When you organized this, you obviously didn't know that we would have been in the crisis where we are currently. And I think it's just so timely that we're together as a body to discuss and to strategize and to think how to advance what we're all about and what we believe in. So to just briefly say, for about a year now, we've been engaging with each other. A group starting last year, February, of about 6 individuals representing accelerators, incubators, capacity builders, has grown to a group of 26 who are actively working with entrepreneurs in many countries all over the world. Most of those organizations serve Christian entrepreneurs. There are some of them who don't exclusively serve Christians, but with a very specific Christian mandate and led by founders or CEOs who have a Christian view of entrepreneurship and the impact that they could have. We've started the process by getting to know each other, which we all thought was the right way to do it, as opposed to just jumping to potential models and solutions for improving and learning from each other. So we took a first year last year of just engaging with each other, and the community grew quite rapidly. We've divided into 3 working groups this year. One of those group looking at funding and investment, another group looking at monitoring and evaluation, and the third looking at general foundations for building a high quality incubator or accelerator. Looking at things like recruitment of participants, the marketing of the program, etc. What we've seen so far is encouraging in the sense that it's very clear that this is a global move of God. The sense of unity, the sense of a common vision that we are all pursuing is really inspirational. Looking at the crisis we're currently in, it's been amazing to see how the community has come together in different parts of the world. For example, in East Africa, there's a part of the community that is working on setting up a recovery fund that could support entrepreneurs who are well established but could potentially suffer or not make it through the COVID-19 crisis. And we foreseen that in the coming time that we're going to see much more of those type of collaborations happening, of groups similar to ours coming together and working together for a common goal of advancing the type of entrepreneurship that both develops and contributes to the economy and the social well-being of a country, but also that advances the kingdom and glorifies God.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks for joining all the way from South Africa. Okay, next we have Scott Weiss. Scott, could you answer this question? As we contemplate ways for churches to foster, launch, and/or partner with programs such as Ocean, what lessons can you share with us on the relationship between Ocean and Crossroad Church? What works, what doesn't work, and what are some of the possible tensions that you've experienced?
Thanks, Jen. It's thrilling to be here. To answer that question, let's just step back and look at what is the universal entrepreneurial journey. Someone decides they want to launch a business, they begin leaning into it, and at the point they pull the trigger, they are suddenly totally and completely overwhelmed with work. They got into whatever business it was for a passion they had to solve a problem, but once they open their door, they're doing everything else. They're doing invoicing, procurement, marketing, pricing, hiring, all the registration issues, all the legal issues. And as someone who's an entrepreneur gets more and more overwhelmed with work, they respond by working more and more. And they give things up, and they give up family, and they give up friends, they give up fitness practices, and they give up faith. And the data shows this are the sacrifices they make. So in essence, I'm describing a human being who is sinking more and more into isolation and being alone. And friends, that's exactly the human being that the church needs to reach and support. So to swing that back around to practical lessons on how we work effectively with Crossroads, first is we both share a deep commitment to supporting entrepreneurs on that journey. While we have never been a part of Crossroads, we actually were birthed out of Crossroads by a bunch of entrepreneurs that were starting businesses in their lobby and got together and thought, well, we ought to see if anybody else wants to participate. And this Ocean programs grew out of that. So first, you have to share a mission that the entrepreneur is important. Second, you have to be willing to meet the entrepreneur where they are and provide the two things they need more than anything. One is connection, and the other is salient content, connection and content. And so we meet frequently with Crossroads to both share our programming and where we're going, who we're trying to serve. And then we serve them as well as several other local churches by always hosting that programming when we could meet together in their buildings, which is bringing new people into their buildings seeking both community and content. And then finally, you just get real practical about what we're good at and what they're good at. And so when we have a relative strength or a gifting, we lean into it. And when they do, we're not hesitant at all to ask them.
That's great. Thank you, Scott. Okay, our last panelist, we have Kyle Bodie. Kyle, what do you think needs to happen to improve the yield of investment in faith and work entrepreneurship?
Yeah, thank you. Good to see a lot of faces I know and meet additional partners and friends. I would say just two things off the top of my head really have to do with, number one, I think there needs to be some type of a framework to bring a cohesive whole to the ideas of faith and work, faith and entrepreneurship, in ways that help everybody, regardless of what your role is, what your vocation is, whether you're a pastor or an entrepreneur, better understand what that whole landscape looks like and how these ideas inform what you're trying to do as an entrepreneur or as a pastor or as a plumber, just a better understanding of your vocation. That also helps, quite frankly, investors like the Kern Family Foundation or others who may be financial partners in some of these efforts, better understand where a particular organization may fit in this landscape, and it helps them kind of identify where do they want to make their impact in the broad kind of faith and work, faith and entrepreneurship space. Also, I think taking lessons from entrepreneurship in general, particularly if these are nonprofits that are getting involved. Somewhere along the line, we kind of grew up with this notion that nonprofit means no profit or no additional revenue streams. And that then kind of leads you to look at the world as scarce resources. And so everybody's competing for the same type of funding that's out there to support their programs. I think this kind of reduces that division of labor, a point Scott just made in terms of finding what you're good at and lean into that. And then if you recognize other partners are good at something, don't hesitate to try to lean into that with them or have them take the lead. I think that would really help kind of drive a departure away from every organization trying to do everything. And that just leads to a lot of duplicated work. I think it leads to actually a lower yield in terms of what the investment is getting across the board. So seeing particularly nonprofit organizations embrace more of an entrepreneurial mindset in terms of how they're approaching their work, where they're trying to work, what they're trying to accomplish, I think would greatly improve the level of yield that comes from investment in these spaces.
Thanks, Kyle. It's great input. I want to just remind everyone to add questions to the chat. We've heard a lot of good points through the panel just now, so please feel free to add your questions there. But for now, I'm going to ask one question to our panelists. Each of you will have just 1 to 2, 3 sentences to share, but I will call on each of you in a random order to answer this particular question. So, how can the Christian community be the indispensable growth partner of young people in their entrepreneurial journey? So I have randomly elected Scott Weiss as the brave soul to start this conversation.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate that. The Bible is the best training manual that exists. And we have to work very hard to make the Bible accessible and relevant to today's young people. And in so doing, we will unlock incredible wisdom and motivation for them.
Thank you. Okay, how about Pastor Eve? Could you answer that question?
I think that the church definitely can be a great growth partner for young people. If I give an example of Kenya, our median age of our population is only 19 years. 70% of our population is below 30 years. That means we have a huge curve or bulge of young people with a lot of energy, want to make a difference, very passionate, have amazing, brilliant ideas and ambitions. Yet the unemployment rate, for instance, in Kenya, for youth is nearly 18%, and that's pretty high. So you have so many graduates who are out there on the streets and are not able to get jobs. And our education system generally prepares us for employment and not for entrepreneurship. And therefore, there's a big part that we can play as a church, because many young people in Kenya, at least there's some surveys that were done recently, they do look up to religious leaders. They do look up to the church. And the church is a place of community, and young people enjoy community and thrive on community. And therefore, if we create spaces in church where they can come and incubate their ideas, where we can affirm them and teach them biblical principles of setting up business and equip them with business skills, then we can be an amazing growth partner in scaling those ideas into something that is useful and meaningful and can make a difference.
Thank you. Let's go to South Africa with Philip.
Thank you, Jen. There's 2 things that I'd like to add. Firstly, I believe that the church can help young people dream and get a vision, not a vision necessarily for their lives, but get and grasp the vision that God has, the plan that God has for the world. Entrepreneurs are problem solvers, and every entrepreneur has a vision. Entrepreneur, someone who leads a business or a nonprofit, has a vision and has a means of bringing that vision to pass. And if I think about South Africa, we've got a very unequal educational system, and many other parts of society similar. But for most children, they get an opportunity to go to school. They get an opportunity to build basic skills of maths and language and so forth. What they don't get is the exposure to dream and to have a vision. And what better way, as Scott said, as the Bible to help children. If we can help them, if we can make the word alive to them, that they can dream with the heroes of faith and the heroes of the Bible, and through that develop a vision, or as I said, plug into the vision that God has for the world and see beyond what is going on around them, but led and inspired by the Spirit. And then the second thing relating to that is role models, and again, biblical role models, but also role models that are currently in our churches. The church environment where I grew up, I had the understanding that the highest calling as a Christian, and the typical role model is someone who preaches to 1 million people in Northern Africa, or someone who sacrifices their life as a missionary in South America. And if we as the church can pose role models, Christian entrepreneur role models to younger people, as an alternative calling to their lives, a equally important calling as to becoming a missionary or a pastor. That would also contribute to them dreaming, having visions about becoming entrepreneurs.
Thank you, Philip. Kyle.
Yeah, I think to draw on another element of the work that the foundation does, we focus on character formation as well. And one of the things that we really push in terms of character formation is the idea that it's not one individual or one organization's responsibility to form somebody's character. It really does take a full community. Character is what we like to say is taught, caught, and sought. And so people are looking around to say, okay, my parents are telling me one thing about who to be and how to be that person. Is my church reinforcing that same message? Are my neighbors reinforcing that same message? Do I hear the same message in school? And that helps cultivate and build character. I think in terms of this question, it really comes down to me about just increasing awareness of what types of journeys, vocational journeys people are on, so that the Christian community, whether it's the church or Christian schools or nonprofits or just individual members in a church, can just be a little more aware of what is that vocational journey, and if nothing else, kind of offer encouragement in that journey. I think the Christian church is just awash in the ability to connect people to resources, to other people who may help them on those journeys, and it doesn't always happen. And so I think the more we can encourage an awareness and a use of all the gifts within the Christian community to encourage others on those vocational journeys, the more people feel encouraged, I think the more that they will be able to be successful in these journeys.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm reading the chat, and we've got some good questions coming in, and we've got two that are directed to you, Kyle. And I think picking up on what you mentioned about this framework, and even what you just shared about really being able to map what are the existing entrepreneurial journeys that we should be responding to, and how do we build frameworks and put some taxonomy and language to those journeys. So from Kevin, he says, Kyle, how do you get organizations to collaborate in that way? I totally believe this. The key thing is you have examples of how to shift the normal mentality that tends to be non-collaborative. So really, how do you get organizations to collaborate and shift their mentality towards collaboration?
Yeah, I think there's a fine line from the foundation's perspective. We can certainly encourage it, and we always have the philanthropic hammer to force collaboration if we want. That's not necessarily the best way to go about it. In fact, we have found many times we can get any group we want to get into a room with any other group, and they'll happily do it. That doesn't mean it'll result in collaboration. So I think where from the investor side, whether you're an individual investor or a foundation, I think maybe encouraging that and then making sure you get out of the room and let the organizations or individuals really determine, build relationships and determine what is their missional alignment with one another and exactly what are they trying to accomplish. And you can put some type of seed funding or encouragement there in terms of financial resources to prompt that. But then you need to kind of back off a little bit and let that happen organically. We focus a lot on what wants to happen versus what we think ought to happen. And we try to put our money behind what wants to happen if it's missionally aligned with us. I think just another way that investors can support this or foundations can support this, and we've certainly done it, is just continue to bring people together like we're doing on this call, because not the entire group won't collaborate necessarily over time, but you're going to start to see little pockets, you know, people here and there who connect. Oh, I like what you said. Let's talk more. And I think there just needs to be more of that marinating in what everybody else is doing to better understand how you might work with one particular organization or another. So I think that convening piece, putting some resources on the table, but you really have to align around mission and desired outcomes, because we've found that even groups that we've thought shared the same kind of mission and desired outcomes in the end didn't. And that's where the collaboration just never took off.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've got one question for you, Kyle, once again. In this time of global crisis, how do we encourage organizations to stay within their calling and avoid mission creep, as they may be tempted to do it all in order to attract new donors?
Yeah, quite frankly, I think this is where highlighting the stories and what it really takes to be a successful entrepreneur can really come in handy for some of these organizations. So I think being exposed, having organizations be more exposed to the discipline that entrepreneurship takes to be successful, to just keep hammering away and staying on track versus starting to, you know, look out over the horizon and try to serve too many customers at once or try to provide too many products at once. That's where I think particularly the entrepreneurs could be very useful in these types of conversations, because they've got that discipline to say, you know, I just had to keep going. I couldn't do all these interesting things that I wanted to do or seemed fascinating. I just had to keep pounding away at the same thing. And I think those stories could really influence leaders of other organizations to be a little bit more hesitant to simply jump in with an idea that matches some funders' priorities or some funders' mission just to, you know, get the dollars or develop another funding relationship.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we've got some really interesting dialogue happening in the chat. I wanted to read Matt Rustin's comment as made to flourish in the chat. You can see it there, but he says the importance of storytelling and modeling, young adults looking for beautiful lives, and when churches find ways to tell stories of how entrepreneurs are creating value and meeting needs, this is an important piece of forming the imagination of young adults. I think that's an incredible point. I just want to mention and highlight that we've got, in response to Rob's comment about what are some existing frameworks or several examples of frameworks that we can draw from. In the chat from Missy, we have creation, fall, redemption, restoration. We have the Heart Community World Framework. Kyle, you mentioned the COT, SOT, TOT framework as well. And so we've got some good input. Unfortunately, we're right at time for our panel. I just want to say a big thank you to our panelists for giving of their time and their insight and really being able to contribute in an impactful way to really push this conversation forward. To move us into our next session, I'd like to ask Caleb Hiddleston to lead us into our breakouts. Thanks, everyone.
I'm going to share my screen so that we can see the mural. And this is where each group took their notes. So I'll go ahead and start first and lead. So the first question that we talked about, by the way, if you didn't get a chance to meet me, my name is Liam. I work with our innovation team here, and they're the ones who are facilitating the mural with you. So I'm excited to get a chance to share. All right, so for the first question, as we were looking into ways of fostering entrepreneurship with the next generation. In ours, one of the first things that we were talking about was exposure. So we wanted to focus on giving them access to entrepreneurs, that they can see it as something where they would say, you know, that could be me. That's something that is feasible, something that's practical, not something that's far off and inaccessible. And you know, what gets celebrated gets replicated. So how are we equipping our churches to celebrate and therefore replicate and recognize entrepreneurship? Some of the other ideas were similar and very closely related. The other thing that we talked about was how important character formation is in entrepreneurship to be successful. So as you were thinking about being more important than doing, a lot of the children and youth growing up in inner city or underprivileged environments don't necessarily have the same experiences and dispositions that make them successful as entrepreneurs. So focusing on character and helping them to have that resilience and that desire and that godly mindset is a really helpful start and a necessary foundation for entrepreneurship. The second one, the second question is we're talking about working to foster Christian entrepreneurship, what's working and what's not working. Some of the things that were not working were collaboration. You know, how can we better leverage and the success of others always, rather than always reinventing? The other thing that came out as important was, you know, what worked for the growth phase, what worked when you first started your organization cannot be the thing that sustains you long term. And a lot of times organizations end up just doubling down on what worked in the first place, rather than having a culture of innovation and celebrating innovation and being willing to break the mold and try new things and abandon darlings. So figuring out ways to change that mindset and approach to ministry is really critical. We had a third question that we talked about regarding economic development. And one of the things that came up as being really valuable is whether you're an involved investor or a disengaged investor. And that's kind of this dichotomy is we've seen the most successful investments are ones where someone is able to stay involved and have that accountability and mentorship. But a lot of investors don't necessarily have the time to invest the time to manage those people who they're investing in. So there's a model around charter schools where they have a really academically excellent team that understands every aspect of charter schools, and they then manage a fund, a pot of funds that investors can support, and they know that those funds are going to be used well to support the objectives there. So we talked about how no one is really doing this in the majority world very well. And so how do we create something where there's oversight and investment and that community of accountability around investments that give the confidence to new investors to invest and know that their money is going to be spent, and that will also generate returns. So, all right, that's it for group one, or group four actually. So I'm gonna go ahead and move over to group one. So who was the mural facilitator for group one, and help me walk through some of the key takeaways from your group?
That was me. So we talked about a lot. It was a great conversation. I think one of the first kind of places that we started just to establish some context was really thinking about, you know, what the church has done so far or maybe hasn't done, right? So thinking about what are some models of Christian entrepreneurship that exists? What are visions that are established, whether in scripture or within the community of the church itself? For entrepreneurship, what are examples that people can look to and aspire to, and how do you create that even as a possibility, right, in a young entrepreneur's mind? And then connected to that, we also discussed just entrepreneurship as a biblical value. So, you know, if learning about entrepreneurship doesn't necessarily come through church, we see that existing mindsets kind of focus on, you know, submission or financial stewardship. So how do you sort of empower young entrepreneurs to be able to see those things not as limitations, but really to be able to just reference in theology the freedom that they have to fail or to be wrong, and the redemption that's available to them when they do. So yeah, just some of those support structures for risk taking within the church, and that's supported by theology.
That's awesome.
And then beyond that, we also thought about just mindsets of entrepreneurial thinking. So we thought about entrepreneurship as social impact. So just positioning it as a way to build potential for others to prosper, and then teaching young leaders to value their own voices and potentially limiting mindsets of just submission to others.
That's good.
And how those can be limiting. So last couple things, we also talked about specifically from the majority world perspective, just cultural limitations of entrepreneurial thinking that exist, maybe in oppressive environments, and then also thinking about just the different types of entrepreneurship that entrepreneurs are born out of, kind of different environments of maybe they need to just put food on the table to survive, or maybe they have a grand vision. So trying to acknowledge and accommodate those. And for the second question, we also talked about just the importance and centrality of community and really how they've been seeing a demand for interest in how marketplace involvement can become ministry. So those were some of the big thoughts that we talked about.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Amy. Sorry I went too fast. All right, let's go to group 2. Who led this one?
That'd be me.
Hey, Julie.
Hello. Hi, I don't know if I haven't met a lot of you. My name is Julie Prash. I am based out of Wisconsin. I've had the privilege of working with One Hope for over 11 years now. So we had a really great discussion. I was a fly on the wall. So I had a lot of questions come to mind. But what I took away from what everybody was saying is that there seems to be a base and a theological need. Obviously, we need to do more work on this front, but one of the things that kept coming up was kind of the ideology within the church of that entrepreneurship might be bad. And so we need to kind of reframe the definition for Christians based on a Christian worldview. What does entrepreneurship mean? And what does that look like? The marketplace is part of God's original plan. You can do good within the church, but you can also do good for God and serve Him, working and doing things outside of the church. And it doesn't have to be a nonprofit organization. It can be, but there are a lot of different avenues that you can serve God and further His kingdom. You need to understand what the baseline is for understanding where the worldview comes from for this, where the Christian worldview comes from, especially for different generations, because they're going to have a different take on what it looks like, and they're going to interpret it differently. So we need to spend the time to get to know them before we can actually start to put the building blocks down and start to teach them. I would say the second big thing that came up was having role models to be involved. And so people that are already in those positions, examples of them, people that are being successful and interacting with young people in those areas, to kind of say, here's how I did it, and here's an example of what you can do.
That's good.
So some of the positive ones, there was a lot of generality in our group, and I know that they had a lot of personal experiences with a lot of different organizations. I know Jen and Jose were keeping track, so if anybody wants more information on different organizations, but the ones that popped out for me was a support group for entrepreneurs. I think Missy is the one that brought that up. She said that they have like-minded entrepreneurs at the same kind of level, looking at the same things. So they give a framework of what can this look like with the gospel? What are the pressing issues? What are the problems? So they meet weekly, just like an AA group, for to support each other and to help each other. And I'm sure it's great to know somebody has your back. So I think that's a great idea. Another thing that was working is to be able to give them practical ways to move forward. So instead of just saying, here's a bunch of ideas, how to put those things into place. So which has a negative here, one of the problems or something that isn't working was that it's often very difficult to hand off after a session or after a group where you're ideating, where you're coming up with ideas. It's, people might like all those ideas and say, hey, that's great. But then when it's time to hand it off and for them to proceed with next steps, they're kind of at a stop and they don't know how to proceed on their own after that meeting. So And then the other one that stood out was the need to consider how macroeconomics, environment, and government policies affect entrepreneurs. So those are a lot of big, heavy issues that, need diving into. And, I bet we could have a whole meeting just on those two things. So
that's awesome. All right. Thanks so much, Julie. We're going to go over to Henry with group 3. So let's see. All right. Talk me through it.
Yeah, hello everyone. Henry, it's good to meet you all. So our group had a really great discussion. Most of the discussion centered around the top two, the top right sticky notes. The first one was around starting early and helping infuse a new kind of thinking. So Eve early on spoke about the fact that most education systems prepare young people to be employees, but how can we, as a Christian community, help young people and just create spaces to teach principles of entrepreneurship. And then the second part of the conversation really centered about introducing mentors, heroes, and models to help them in their journey. So young people really have, they normally tend to look up to people. So how can we provide mentors and heroes and people that they can look up to and stories? And how can we share stories of value that then can gear them towards entrepreneurship? What does it look like to not only share like the good parts of stories, but also telling brokenness in stories? Because the brokenness is really the main part of our story as a Christian community, right? So how can we not make stories unachievable or really difficult for a young person to feel like they can relate to it, but rather they can connect with it and instead feel inspired to entrepreneurship. So most of our conversation centered around those two things. And for the next question in regards to what is working and what is not working, what is working is the spaces that we have as a church or as a Christian community to create and connect with others. So to have fellowship, mentorship, and accountability. Discipleship is working, putting people in group where they can just be just authentically walk together and share life together. Just as a church, being able to share the vision of how entrepreneurship in the Christian community can really change and restore the world around us. So we had really great stories from the people in our group that were able to share things that have worked in their own personal experiences. And on the side that is not working, we spoke a lot about the quality of content that we get to see in Christian gatherings. Sometimes it's not the greatest, so maybe improving that, the dichotomy that exists in a Christian community, to the belief that maybe the only way to be a real Christian or a sold out Christian is to be a missionary or to just sell everything and just pursue and share the gospel, but rather like being an entrepreneur is a really good way of being a Christian and being light to the world. Also, the exclusion of anyone who is not in the high-tech venture world. People that are not in that space sometimes feel excluded, especially when it comes to funding. And in regards to funding, thinking about how might we develop a way to provide funds to people who are under-resourced. So people that have a great idea, but they don't have the funds. And how can we do that effectively? And that's currently not working.
I was muted. Thanks so much, guys, for sharing. I really appreciate it. Tons of great insights and thoughts coming out of the group. So I'm going to pass it now to Jen, who's going to lead us into our next section. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Liam. Hey, everyone, again. Now we're going to move into a 25-minute discussion with Rob and everyone on this call, and to really facilitate some good conversation. I'm going to ask for everyone's help. So if you could submit questions based on anything we've discussed today, from the panel to the breakouts and to the summary that we just heard, feel free to directly input those into the chat. If you would not like to speak, I can ask on your behalf to Rob. But if you'd like to raise your hand on the screen visually so we can see you, we'll call on you and you can ask your question that way. So Rob, are you ready for a good discussion?
Let's go.
Okay. So Rob, to get us started, I would really love to hear from you, sort of the why behind today. Why has One Hope convened this incredible group today? And also would just love to hear some of your reflections and responses to what has been discussed so far.
Okay, sure. I think, as most of you probably know, One Hope is a research-based organization. So we spend millions of dollars a year, probably more than any other Christian organization I know, in investing in global research on the beliefs, values, and attitudes of children and youth around the world. We did our ABY, or Attitudes and Belief of Youth, which, as far as I know, was the largest ever study. It was 155,000 young people in 40 plus countries. And then more recently, we're involved in what we're calling our Global Gen Z research, which is another global international study of tens of thousands with qualitative and quantitative research, trying to understand the generation so that the church can understand how to do evangelism and discipleship, and nurturing this generation for kingdom activity and work. And so just reading that research, what we have found across the board was a very anemic theology of work, that the church globally has really done a poor job of discipling their children and young people in a theology of work. And this has created a huge vacuum within the ability for the church to properly serve God's kingdom on earth. So as One Hope, we said we have to start building more theology of work into our catechisms that we create, and into our Sunday school programs, and into our scripture engagement programs. And so as we started digging into this, the first thing we did is we did discovery. And many of you came out of our lit review of what are sort of the best in class taking place around the world that are actually engaged in helping a new generation think. If someone could mute, I think there's some background talking there. So really our research is demanding that One Hope do a better job of preparing our church constituencies around the world. That was the driving factor. The second came from what we call our coalition of transformational churches. So it came from the grassroots up, from the research from the children and youth, but then it came from the top down, from who is our accountability structure around the world. So One Hope has an advisory council of apostolic leaders, denominational leaders. So when One Hope, we say, last year we reached 120 million kids through our programs. 120 million kids were recipients of our 300 plus programs. And we don't say we reached 120 million kids. What we say is One Hope served churches that reached 120 million kids. Our missiology is built around a local church ecclesiology. We believe that we're here to support the church in order to reach their community of children and young people. And what we found is that the brightest and best of our churches around the world that we saw were creating the most spiritually vibrant young people. And Eve Mongai would be an example of that. Bishop Bronner's church would be an example of that, creating spiritually vibrant children and young people. What those leaders from around the world were asking and demanding of One Hope is, we have to grow in this space, in this area. The world has changed around us. And here's what we heard from majority world church leaders. We're sick and tired of charity. We are sick and tired of the West coming in and dumping money on our communities. Even though we're under-resourced in the area of money, we're not under-resourced in the area of ideas and the spiritual vibrancy of our young people. And what we want is investment. We want investment in economic development so that we don't have to depend on the charity from the West any longer. This is a cry from the majority world church right now. And what we found is there have been inadequate structures to facilitate these very resourced global churches in order to take the next step forward in raising a generation of young entrepreneurs that can have economic sustainability to solve the problems in their own country. So that's why we're having this conversation, and we're learning a lot. I've learned a ton already today, but our hope is that we can accumulate all of this that we're learning from most of you that are experts, subject matter experts and practitioners, and sort of combining it and seeing if we can present back to the CTC, this group of apostolic leaders that literally represent tens of thousands of churches around the world, millions of parishioners around the world, And we really believe from our 32 years of work, they are the part of the church that best understands the next generation around the world. So they're vetted. They're incredible churches, they're incredible communities, they're incredible leaders. And what they're saying is one of their highest priorities is creating a theology of work that produces a new model of entrepreneurship in the church. I mean, a ton of them have saying, you know, most of our young people go to their school guidance counselors to decide what their vocation in life is going to be. We are ill-equipped in the church to give vocational guidance to our own children and young people. We should be the first place where our young people are coming to determine what are my gifts, where can they best be used, and how do I transform the world around me through the help of the church walking alongside of me. And we just see inadequate models to do that. So we really can't do our job of God's word every child and presenting the correct sort of catechesis and theology to the churches that we serve around this area of theology of work and entrepreneurship and being able to raise up a generation that thinks differently than prior generations. Our initial research is showing that Gen Z is very different. Only 4% of Gen Z resides in the United States. 96% of Generation Z resides in the rest of the world. And so what we find is that this generation of Gen Z don't want to be consumers, they want to be creators. They want to be independent, and they want to, if you read Margaret Mead she was absolutely prophetic as the leading anthropologist of the 20th century to say technology is going to change everything. And what it's going to change is that these young people are going to become pre-figurative, not post-figurative. In other words, they're going to figure out for themselves because their access to knowledge is so great that they will determine their own futures. But what they will not have, she said correctly, is wisdom. So we need to combine the wisdom of the church and the Bible along with the creativity and the entrepreneurship of this rising Gen Z generation. If we can't figure that out as the church and the kingdom, then we're not going to adequately disciple this next generation to have an impact in the world. So that's what our cry is One Hope. And thank you all for participating on this call so that we can learn as a community to serve the global church around the world better. Sorry, I started preaching.
I love it. Thanks, Rob. Okay, let's get started with another question. So can you share what is the question you receive most from aspiring entrepreneurs in the majority world and under-resourced communities, and give a response to that?
Yeah, I think the number one response I get from young people themselves is, I've got a great idea, but my church doesn't seem to celebrate this idea that I have. And if I was, wanting to be a pastor or an evangelist or go to Bible school, then my church would really support me. But I have a business idea. I have an agricultural idea, and my church doesn't seem to help me with that. So that's one of the questions I'm getting from young people. The second question I get from young people is, I've got a great idea. I love God. I want to serve God. They seem to have a really good missional vision, and they seem to have good values, but then they ask, but I can't get any funding. I don't have access to resources. And so it is a resource and funding question that they seem to have, especially from the poorest places in the world. So those would be the two number one sort of questions or comments I get from young people themselves. I think from the church, let me just sort of jump to sort of the best in class churches around the world and the questions they're asking me, because I agree with a lot of the comments made on the call that we need to do a lot of advocacy for a lot of churches that don't even see the need to have a theology of work. We need to do advocacy among churches that aren't really, they're not giving, and we're helping churches to do that, to build a biblical theology into their catechism of healthy work and being in the marketplace. But for the sake of this conversation, I think beyond the advocacy question is churches like Eve, at ICC, are great churches that we work with around the world who really have done a great job of teaching kingdom principles and that they value business people in the marketplace. What they're saying is there aren't proper structures. So if you listen to Eve's interview that she did with Jen, she said, we have been developing and discipling our young people, and we have thousands of them now that are ready to launch into the space. but it's hard for us as the church to be the fund. We need an in-between group because we don't want to be a Shylock, I think is the word that you used, Eve. We don't want to be the lender. We don't want to have to evaluate sort of the ROI of these businesses, which needs to be done for good business practice, but we don't want to be in that place. Is there another organization that can sort of step in and help the church globally? In our case in Kenya, but we're hearing this, I get this question from a pastor of a great church in Paris. I've gotten it from a great church in Zimbabwe. There seems to be a missing layer of enterprise within the church to be able to have a pool of resources and funds that they can draw on and help manage that on behalf of the church. Whether that's we've heard NCF, or we've heard the Global Christian Council, or whether something new needs to be created that's a collaborative of different organizations. So those are some of the questions I'm hearing, Jen, from the global church and from young people themselves.
That's great, thank you. So another question, how can churches deploy entrepreneurship programs and really diversify their revenue streams through products and services without becoming the bad guy when investments fail?
Yeah, I think that was one of Eve's concerns, is that it's hard for a church to be discipling young people and also to be their investor. So that is a real challenge. Let me just speak from my own experience as One Hope. My dad was an entrepreneur who founded One Hope. He never took a salary, still never has taken a salary from One Hope. He's always been one of our leading donors. He's just been very successful in business. So he's had a strong propensity to, as an entrepreneur, to build businesses. I grew up in the Middle East. He was a tent maker. He was owned the British Caledonian Airlines franchise for the Middle East, and that supported our missionary habits. So I come from a family that's built around entrepreneurship, and so we've always built that into our One Hope culture. I think it was Kyle that said, we really can't foster entrepreneurship if we're not entrepreneurs ourselves. Like, if you're a church and you're not entrepreneurial as a church, you really don't have much guidance to give to the young people in your church. So I really believe that a healthy model for some of these churches that are wanting to disciple or start an incubator or start an accelerator, they have to have a proven track record. And so at One Hope, what I did is I welcome the entrepreneurial ideas of our young team members. And we had an internal fund that we established to invest in ideas that could be revenue generating beyond donations and nonprofit activity. We've invested in 4 of those. Probably our total outlay in dollars has been less than $500,000. And now that fund has grown to over $14 million that we're managing. So I can tell you at One Hope, it's worked. There's a generation that has incredible ideas. And if they can have seasoned veteran leaders come alongside them and help disciple and hold them accountable, this can be a profitable enterprise for us. And so my vision for One Hope is that a lot of our national programs become totally self-supporting, not so that we won't have to continue to raise money in the West to support One Hope around the world. And so this is as simple as one of our directors in Costa Rica that wanted to start a bus company. And so we bought him his first bus. Now he's on to his second bus. He's completely self-supporting now, our office in Costa Rica. So I really think we have to build this entrepreneurship into the fiber of who we are and begin to practice a different type of business model as the church. So we're encouraging churches to do that. We're making actual out of this fund, we're making investment in some of our church leaders around the world for them to start entrepreneurial business models out of the church itself, to really create a culture of entrepreneurship that's driven at the local church level.
That's great. In my breakout session, Andrew Sears brought up the concept of the entrepreneurial mindset and really beginning to instill that in this next generation, but also in churches of really emphasizing what does it mean to think like an entrepreneur, and how do you bring that to your 7 days of the week. So Rob, I want to catch you up on some of the chat that's happening. Andreas, he had a comment that said the problem is how we dump money in the mission field. We need to be rethinking the way we are providing funding for the work in the field. He also mentioned it could be a good idea to have a clearinghouse of sorts, a entrepreneurship central, where organizations like ours could upload biblically based materials that churches can download worldwide. And Fernando mentioned, a great phenomenon that he's noticing among Gen Z across platforms is a lot of content that's activating entrepreneurs in this next generation. So any responses, thoughts to what's happening in the chat?
Well, I haven't been able to read the chat because I've been talking. So I would love to sort of hear from others that might have some answers to that. I think out of group 4, one of the things that we were talking about was, Andres brought up that the translation business around the world was transformed, and it was really transformed by 2 major donors, Mark Green and Catherine Barnhart, who said, it's a broken model. There isn't enough collaboration going on. We're getting appeals from all the different translation agencies, and they don't have their act together. They're not coordinating their efforts. And out of that, they use the collective impact framework in order to create E10, every tribe, every nation, which has streamlined Bible translation. What would have taken 350 years is now going to take 34 years because of better coordination, better collaboration, better training, common language, and basically using the 5 principles of collective impact, which are having a common agenda, shared measurement system, reinforcing activities, having a backbone organization and constant communication, having platforms for sharing best practices, et cetera. So I think those principles, what I'm hearing might be applied to pulling together some of the organizations, some of the individuals like you who have spent a large portion of your life committed to this. But maybe we need to create a better mousetrap. Maybe we need to be able to create a better platform, and perhaps collective impact could be the right type of framework for us to begin to say, is there a better vehicle? Is there a better platform for us to be able to take what is all this great thinking and make it available to the church around the world to have access to not only the best practices, not only the collaborative learning, not only the great teaching that's available, not just the programs and the products, but also, and what I'm hearing is perhaps there needs to be a fund. Kyle, maybe you can share about the charter school fund that Kern has been involved in, because I think that could be another really great model. Like, it's really hard for a funder to say, hey, I'm just going to go start charter schools. There needs to sort of be an organization that you trust, that has best practices, has good leadership, has the right economic models, that you can then invest in them so that they can sort of carry that vision on for you. Would you mind sharing that, Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes to a lot of what people have been sharing around the idea of pooling funds. Also, how do churches or individual investors, for individual investors or others, they don't always have the time to understand how their funds are being used well. They need a team they can trust, a team that maybe has more on-the-ground experience than they do. They may love children and providing great education for children, but they don't know how to run a charter school. They just like the idea. So finding a team that brings that experience. It also puts in place a little bit of that middleman that we were discussing before, in terms of, it is hard as a donor sometimes to pull back funding based on lack of performance or things like that. And so I know churches don't necessarily want to be in that position. But if churches had a trusted entity that could hold other groups accountable for performance, it makes it a little bit easier. And that's a role that in the charter school space, a group like the Growth Fund has played. They know everything from, high quality academic excellence, to how to prepare teachers and principals, to how to help schools find facilities, to loans and how to structure those for schools. So that gives donors an incredible vehicle through which to invest and see results. And they also know that the Growth Fund is holding these academic and principal entrepreneurs to some extremely high standards, because it takes a lot to get an investment from the Growth Fund. So an entity like that could really help meet multiple needs here.
Scott, you've got a great example that you just posted on the chat. Could you share that with us about what Crossroads is doing?
So the question I was responding to was, how can we connect young people around the world more effectively with entrepreneurs or business leaders that can mentor them? And I just shared a story at Ocean on when we began, we went out of our way to cast our vision, what we were trying to do and accomplish within the church I attend, which is Crossroads. And then later we've done that within about 5 local churches, and we do that annually. It's kind of like our day to pitch. And then we ask people, if you're interested, if you're an entrepreneur or business leader, here's our site, volunteer. 95% of our human resources are complete volunteers. And the most common quote I get from volunteers is, I've been asked to write a lot of checks, I've been asked to serve a lot of coffee, and I've been asked to open a lot of doors. But I've never been asked to do what I actually love, which is to share my business wisdom and knowledge and how I integrate that with my love of the Lord. So every year we have people sign up, we pick people to volunteer, we tell them they get to serve 1 year, we train them, we give them a written job description, and we evaluate them. And then the next year we get a fresh group. I think the biggest barrier to getting people involved or getting young people access to entrepreneurs is we just don't ask. We just don't ask. And then we don't prepare them to succeed. So if we can find ways to do that, particularly in the majority world, I think we can connect people far more effectively than we have been.
Rob, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, am I unmuted? Yeah, there I am now. Great insights, Scott, and so critical for us. And what I see is, even maybe Eve can speak to this, but many times, particularly in the majority world, there's almost been a stigma around business because of what's associated sometimes with corruption and just the image of a businessman. And so you have tremendous majority world business people that are beginning to emerge, but there seems to be a disconnect sometimes from some of those that have been very successful in business in your national context. Eve, maybe you can speak to that a little bit. And how do you see the need for us to find national indigenous mentors? And what is the appropriate way to bring in outside resources from the rest of the global church to help perhaps mentor where appropriate? And we want to be very sensitive to the indigenous missiological principles here, but I think there's also a place for missions in the space of entrepreneurship and mentorship. Could you speak to that a little bit from your perspective, Eve?
Yes, thank you, Rob. Yes, indeed, there is sometimes stigma with business people seeing themselves as, the fact that sometimes there's this mentality that if you're very, very prosperous and successful business person, then you must be actually a devil worshipper. That's the interesting thing. Sometimes the people imagine that you can't make wealth in a clean way. You can't be a person of integrity and make wealth. So that's a barrier right there. The other thing is also our culture generally in the, if I can say, the South tends to be, you're not supposed to be a showy person. You're raised not to be a showy person, telling people what you do, how you did it. That can be very Western. And therefore, sometimes it's a barrier to getting people to open up, serious entrepreneurs to open up and tell their story. Now, more increasingly, it's becoming more common, but it has taken a while to get people there where they can actually share their stories and say what went well, what didn't go too well. And otherwise, sometimes entrepreneurs also are afraid that people will come and, if I can put it, let's say in spiritual terms, even, get into witchcraft and try and pull them down, and affect their business. And so people are not very quick to open up and tell you the secrets of their success. So those are some of the barriers that are there. I think one thing that's important when we are looking at identifying those heroes, entrepreneurs who, can be seen as models and icons and who young people can look up to, also is to identify locals where possible, but also get to understand the context. Yeah, and the cultural, context that within whatever community you're targeting, if I can put it that way. Otherwise, sometimes we make assumptions, and those assumptions can really backfire, as you're trying to get people, young people to understand what entrepreneurship is and get excited. So a little bit of research that is very contextualized would help in ensuring that we identify good local entrepreneurs who have the heart for ministry, and even international ones who have a more global view and don't have a very narrow world view, so they're able to share what some of the principles, the values of good business thinking and entrepreneurship is. Because at the end of the day, some of the values are standard, because we're talking about biblical values. Those timeless, those they always work, if I can put it that way. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Eve. Just a closing comment, and I think then it's time for me to turn it back over. But I don't know if some of you recently saw Seth Godin last week had a blog post about COVID-19, and what he said is there are a few times in our histories where something so monumental happens that it actually begins to shape the thinking of an entire generation. And what Seth was talking about was that he actually feels like COVID-19 might be the first time that we've had an event globally that has been so global in its impact and effect that it's going to shape a new generation. And he called it the C generation. He said this generation will not so much be defined as a demographic. Of course, we think this will be very defining for Generation Z, and that's going to probably come out in the research we're doing in our Global Gen Z study right now. But he said this Generation C has three characteristics to it, 3 C's, he said. Number one is connectivity. He said, we have to start understanding that this generation and COVID-19 is just accelerating the inevitable of connectivity. And that's happening right now. I'm looking at Eve's face in Kenya and South Africa, and I have irritable Zoom syndrome right now. I've got this condition, but connectivity is possible at a level and a dimension like we've never experienced before. This generation will be defined by connectivity. Secondly, he said, we are going to be defined by COVID-19, but he defined that as catastrophe. And even Seth Godin, as a secularist, is saying that in some ways we thought our world was so sophisticated that we were immune to catastrophe. And what we found is the catastrophe will not go away. In fact, global catastrophe will become more defined than it ever has been before. This generation is going to be defined by our catastrophes. And then third, he said, he used the word carbon, and what he meant was environmentalism. And this is where I disagree with Seth Godin. I don't think that this definition will be defined by environmentalism. What I think they're going to be defined by is a cause. So the third C for me is a cause. This will be the most cause-oriented generation in the history of humanity. And until the church comes along and helps build a theology of cause that allows them to understand who they are in Christ and how they can impact and change their world in a productive, socially responsible way, and help create incredible transformational outcomes, we are not going to be a very engaging voice for this generation. And of course, we have the greatest cause in the world. We have the cause of Christ. We have the helping serve the kingdom of God to establish itself and bring about transformational change through the gospel, through the good news. That's our cause. But I really believe that under the cause, as the leader of One Hope globally, I really think we have to figure this out, what we're talking about in this conversation today. We have to figure out, how do we allow a generation to rise up globally as a globally connected church? We're more connected, have more capacity to connect than ever before. How do we respond in times of catastrophes like COVID-19 right now with not charity solutions, but sustainable, scalable, replicatable types of ventures that can ensure that we dramatically change the causes, the needs that the global church community is facing around the world. So I believe it. We are the C generation. And just from my perspective, from my seat, before I turn it back, thank you all for investing your time in this call. I promise you that we're going to take everything. Someone had sent a thing saying, can we get a copy of the mosaic and the notes that were made? Everything that's been said on this call is going to be made available to you. But I'm going to ask that we start thinking about next steps. But I've already got a lot of next steps going on in my mind right now. and the roles that all of us perhaps could play in doing a much better job of facilitating this next generation in order for them to take their rightful place in the marketplace, in the business community, to help create transformational ideas and build sustainable businesses that can support their work, rather than on the prior charity models that we were so dependent on in the 20th century. We just can no longer move forward in that way. We have to change the game. We have to change our business models. So thank you all for helping us think through this. And I'll hand it over to the next phase of the wonderful conversation we're having.
Thanks, Rob. We're really grateful for everyone who made the time to join the call today. We don't take it for granted, and our thinking in next steps. You know, for me, this chapter in the conversation really began with walking with two great Christian leaders through a mall in Dubai, and I just said, you know, if you could have any gift from the West, what would you want? And both of them, without hesitation, said, help us build great businesses. Help us build the ecosystems that build great businesses. And that conversation really has stayed with us. And so for us, the starting point wasn't to go and work in isolation and try and build something from scratch, as if none of you aren't, you know, all of you are already out there doing incredible things. So for us, a foundational step was just to invite old friends and new to come together and to begin to talk about this together. And so as a next step, we don't assume that this will be some sort of standing group, but we don't preclude work groups or collaborations coming out of it. So what our thoughts have been is simply to follow up with each of you individually and just begin to talk with you and say, you know, you heard the same context that we did. How can we accelerate greater support, licensing of training content, manuals that have already been written that could be localized, models of activation that are waiting to be translated from the West into additional global settings? How can we do that together? And do you have an appetite, an openness, a willingness? Do you sense this is something God would want you to do? And if so, what role could you play in that? I think you've already seen the interviews that we did with our panelists. We would love to try and set up an opportunity to interview each of you, find out the kind of work that you're doing. We think it could be profoundly useful in accelerating the global church's understanding of this landscape. And then talking with each of you and saying, what role might you play? What opportunities are you aware of? Who else should we be talking with? And so we're going to follow up with a simple email after this to each of you individually and begin to just explore if there are opportunities from your perspective for any of us to collaborate more effectively in accelerating how the church becomes the indispensable growth partner for young people in their orientation towards the marketplace and in their consideration of entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurship as an absolutely legitimate kingdom vocation. And so that's really our next step. Based on that feedback, if there's a desire for additional gatherings, if we start to see any kind of work groups form out of that, we'll follow it with you and we'll keep everyone apprised of where the conversation's at. But we think probably the next step is just to follow up with you individually, give you time to process this. All of the resources that have been created on this call will be provided to you. It's why we've got a significant facilitation team on the call, just to make sure we document it really, really well. So we've got recordings, we've got the mural, we've got notations, and we've got summary decks. All of that will be provided to you. There have been additional requests for ancillary materials like Stanford's Collective Impact Framework. Of course, we'll send those out, and they're already linked in the chat. But this really is going to conclude our day today. We just wanted to start by talking with friends and saying we see this incredible opportunity out there. The global church is asking for help in this space. Christian communities are asking for help in this space. And we know that there's a wealth of experience, of hard-won lessons that have already been attained. And we just want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to connect those dots and to try and serve the church, particularly following the COVID-19 crisis and what we believe is probably going to be an extended season of rebuilding for many of these nations. Yesterday and this morning earlier, we were on with an incredible leader from Africa, and he's saying, you know, right now the biggest question in my mind is, how do I keep 1,500 of my poorest pastors fed? How do I keep any food going to them, to their families during this crisis? So we know there's going to be an incredible time of rebuilding that has to follow this season. And we want to create space for you to be involved if there's any way that we can serve you to do that. And so that's very much our heart. And if it's okay, any final thoughts, please feel free to put them into the text. We would love for you to all have the chance to connect with each other. You've all already got access to the Google site with introductions, so you can connect names and faces. We certainly would encourage that. We know that's something that would normally happen in a physical gathering roundtable event, and this is virtual. So we're trying to support those sorts of connections any way that we can. But we would be thrilled if new friendships and new collaboration comes out of this call, even if it has nothing to do with us. That's great. We really do want to serve the Lord in this, and we believe that the Lord has his plan, and that this is his work and not ours, and we're trying to support it any way that we can. So thank you so much for being part of this, and let me close this with a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Lord, thank you for everyone who's joined the call today. So many people doing amazing work, and that work requires intensity and focus. Lord, for some of us today, this is an incredibly hard season when resources are tight, business models are failing, salaries are being reduced, people that we love are being laid off. Lord, we ask for your mercy and your guidance as leaders to know how to navigate these really difficult times. Lord, we trust that this is a season that you have us in that will come to an end, but Lord, there are lessons for us to learn in this season. And I pray, Lord, that you would help us to learn those lessons, to look to you more, to rely on you more, to be people of action, but under your authority and under your guidance, that we would see, like Isaiah 26 says, that, you know, whatever we've done, Lord, it was you who did it. So help us in this. I pray, Lord, that this conversation might be used by your Spirit to be a first step in new relationships, new friendships, new kingdom collaborations, new adventures. Lord, if it please you to use it that way, we'll be very grateful. Father, thank you for the generosity of everyone who's joined this call, being willing to give of time, being willing to share their hard-won insights. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to steward these insights well and to serve your church and your gospel and your Son, so that we might see his good news proclaimed and we might see people's lives transformed, not only by the work of local churches, but Lord, also by the work of incredible leaders who are bringing your light and your gospel and your good news to the marketplace and learning how to love their neighbor in new ways. Lord, I pray that you would use us, all of us. In Jesus' name, amen.